There are moments in sports where the truth doesn't come from analysts breaking down film, it doesn't come from reporters digging through sources, and it doesn't come from fans piecing together what they saw in real time. Sometimes the truth walks right out of the building on its own, and that is exactly what happened in the hours after the Indiana Fever's game against the Washington Mystics. A current player on the Indiana Fever roster, someone who sits in those huddles, hears those play calls, and stands on that court when the biggest moments arrive, chose to confirm something publicly that the organization had every reason to keep quiet. And what she confirmed has completely shifted the conversation around this team, around its coaching decisions, and around the most talked about player in women's basketball right now. Because what Sophie Cunningham put into the public record doesn't just answer a question fans were debating, it answers it in a way that raises 10 more. And every single one of those questions points in the same direction. Before we get into what Cunningham did and why it matters as much as it does, we need to go back to the game itself, because the context is everything here. Without understanding what happened on that court against Washington, Cunningham's decision to go public doesn't carry the full weight it deserves. The Indiana Fever entered that game and built themselves a 17-point lead. 17 points! In a professional basketball game, that is not a small cushion. That is the kind of lead that should be a closed chapter, a result that gets filed away as comfortable and moves on. Except Indiana nearly gave it all back. The Mystics clawed their way back into that game in a way that had Fever fans watching through their fingers, wondering how a lead that large had evaporated so quickly and so completely. And then, in the closing seconds, with the game suddenly hanging in the balance after Indiana had done everything possible to hand it back to Washington, the final possession arrived. The possession that would decide everything. What happened on that possession is where this entire story begins. Kelsey Mitchell received the basketball. She was immediately met with doubled coverage, two defenders collapsing on her simultaneously, which is the kind of defensive attention that tells you the other team has done its homework on who they expect to have the ball in that moment. And here is where observers watching in real time caught something that would fuel the debate for everything that followed. Mitchell's reaction to that double coverage was almost reflexive. She turned quickly, almost instinctively, the way a player moves when she suddenly realizes she is not supposed to be in the position she finds herself in. And she found Caitlin Clark. Clark caught the ball, and Clark hit the game winner. Indiana survived. Indiana won, and the celebration that followed was real and deserved, because hitting a game-winning shot under that pressure in those final fractions of a second is genuinely extraordinary, no matter how you got there. But the question that immediately followed that celebration was the one that nobody inside the organization seemed eager to answer directly. Was that play designed for Caitlin Clark? Was the coaching staff's intention, when they drew up the action that was supposed to win that game, to put the ball in Caitlin Clark's hands for the decisive moment? Or was Mitchell the designed terminal option, the player the play was built around, and Clark's game-winning heroics the product of individual improvisation within a possession that had already broken down? That question is not a small one. That question is the difference between a coaching staff that trusts its best player with the highest stakes moments and a coaching staff that, even in a game it nearly lost from a 17-point lead, chose to design the most important play of the night around someone other than the player who has transformed everything this league represents. And for weeks, that question sat without a definitive answer, until Sophie Cunningham decided she was done letting it sit. Cunningham went to her Instagram, and what she shared confirmed it. The play was not designed for Caitlin Clark. Let that land for a moment before we move forward because it deserves that space. This was not an outside analyst speculating from a press box. This was not a former player reading the play from television footage and drawing conclusions. This was a current member of the Indiana Fever roster, a player who was in the huddle, who heard the play called, who knows exactly what was drawn up and for whom, and she chose deliberately and publicly to confirm that the play designed for the most important possession of the night was not designed for the best player on her team. The framing of what she shared, the deliberateness of posting it, knowing the environment she was posting into, makes this one of the most significant insider acknowledgments this entire situation has produced. It was not an accident. It was not a slip. It was a choice. And this is not the first time Cunningham has made that kind of choice. If you've been following this Indiana Fever story closely, Cunningham's name has come up before in contexts that made organizational communications staff uncomfortable. Earlier this season, she stepped into media availability and spilled details about the team's defensive scheme with a level of specificity that professional sports organizations typically keep internal. She confirmed Indiana was running a single, uniform switching defensive approach. She referenced a 2-hour team meeting in a way that made it clear this meeting had happened, that it was significant, and that it was not something the organization had been planning to discuss publicly. And when Kelsey Mitchell walked up to the podium shortly after and was asked about what Cunningham had shared, the reaction on Mitchell's face told you everything you needed to know. There was a visible recognition that more information had entered the public domain than the organizational communication strategy had accounted for. That reaction was its own confirmation. Cunningham was not following organizational guidelines. She was operating on her personal standard of transparency.
Understanding why Cunningham operates this way requires understanding something about who she is. She is a Midwest native, and anyone who has spent time around people from that part of the country knows the communication style that region tends to produce. Direct, straightforward, not particularly interested in carefully managing how things are perceived or packaging information in ways that protect organizational narratives. Cunningham does not appear to have a filter that asks, "What does the organization want people to think about this?" before she speaks. She appears to have a filter that asks, "What is actually true?" and then says that. In most professional sports environments, that approach creates friction with the communications infrastructure because professional sports organizations invest enormous energy into controlling the narrative around their teams. What gets said publicly, how it's framed, which information reaches the fan community, and which stays inside the building, all of it is carefully managed. Cunningham, apparently, did not get that particular memo. Or she got it and decided she disagreed with it. For the fans who have been trying to understand what is genuinely happening inside this Indiana Fever organization, that quality has made Cunningham something genuinely valuable because there is a gap between the public-facing narrative of this team and what the evidence of actual games suggests is happening. There have been press conferences full of carefully constructed answers. There has been sideline imagery that tells one story while the play-calling data tells another. And in that environment, a player who simply says what she observed, shares what she knows, and confirms what she witnessed without running it through an organizational filter becomes one of the most reliable sources of real information available. Not because she is trying to cause problems, not because she has an agenda against anyone on her team, but because she values honesty more than she values narrative management. And in this specific situation, that honesty has done something important. What Cunningham's Instagram confirmation actually means, stripped of all surrounding context and stated as plainly as possible, is this. In the most important possession of a game the Indiana Fever nearly lost after building a 17-point lead, the coaching staff did not design the play for Caitlin Clark. The most important creative decision of the most important moment was made without putting the best player on the roster at the center of the design. The coaching staff drew something else up. they drew it up for someone else. And Clark only received the ball because Kelsey Mitchell, suddenly doubled, made the smart, instinctive decision to find the open player rather than try to force her way through two defenders on a play that had already broken down. That is not the same thing as the coaching staff saying, "Caitlin Clark wins this game for us." That is the coaching staff saying something else entirely, and Clark winning it anyway because the player who was supposed to be the primary option recognized she couldn't do it and found the teammate who could. Now here is where this gets even more uncomfortable, because this is not an isolated incident. This is not the one time in an otherwise balanced body of evidence that the coaching staff made a questionable decision about who gets the ball in critical moments. This connects to a pattern that has been building throughout the season. There have been fourth-quarter possessions run through personnel choices that do not reflect the team's best available competitive option. There have been plays designed for Kelsey Mitchell in moments when the analytical community watching those games has been essentially unanimous that the obvious design should involve Clark. There has been a consistent gap between what the evidence of the game suggests the right decision is and what the coaching staff actually chooses. The Washington Mystics game was another chapter in that same story, except this chapter has something the others did not. It has a current player on the roster willing to confirm it publicly, and that confirmation changes the nature of the conversation from speculation to documented organizational reality. Clark converting that shot was extraordinary. Nobody is taking anything away from what she did in that moment. The pressure of that situation, the stakes of the moment, the technical difficulty of receiving a pass in the final fractions of a second and converting from distance with a game on the line, that is the kind of performance that defines careers, that gets played in highlight reels for decades, that reminds everyone watching why this player has captured an audience that women's basketball had never previously attracted at this scale. But Clark converting it on a play that was not drawn up for her, on a pass from Kelsey Mitchell, doubled, who recognized the coverage and improvised the right decision, makes that moment even more extraordinary in one sense, while making the organizational decision that surrounded it even more troubling in another. She saved a result that should never have been in doubt. She did it without the coaching staff designing the most important possession of the game around her, and a teammate made sure the public understood exactly which of those two things was her achievement and which was the organization's failure. And this brings us to Cynthia Cooper. Because in the middle of all of this, one of the most decorated players in the history of women's professional basketball stepped into this conversation with a historical comparison that deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Cooper drew a parallel between Caitlin Clark's impact on women's basketball and Babe Ruth's impact on baseball. And before anyone reacts to that comparison based purely on the names involved, it is worth understanding what Cooper was and was not arguing. She was not arguing that Clark and Ruth are the same player in any narrow basketball or baseball sense. She was not making a statistical equivalence or drawing a competitive parallel. She was making an argument about what it means for a single individual to transform the commercial and cultural landscape of an entire sport at a specific moment in that sport's history. Ruth did not merely play great baseball in the 1920s and 1930s. He brought an entirely new and entirely larger audience to a sport that had previously served a much smaller one. He drove attendance to levels the sport had not previously seen. He generated the kind of media coverage that expanded baseball's reach into communities and demographics that had not previously engaged with it. He created a commercial environment around the sport that would simply not have existed without his specific presence. Baseball before Ruth and baseball after Ruth were not the same commercial enterprise. He changed what the sport was worth, who followed it, and how deeply the culture engaged with it in a way that no other individual player had done before or has done since in quite the same way. The parallel Cooper was drawing is not difficult to identify once you understand the terms of the comparison. Clark's arrival in the WNBA produced the most dramatic commercial transformation in the league's history. Attendance records fell, viewership records were demolished, merchandise demand reached levels the league had never previously approached. National broadcast interest elevated the league's media rights valuation into territory that would have seemed like fantasy before Clark arrived. The commercial ecosystem that now exists around women's professional basketball is not the ecosystem that existed before she showed up. She changed it. Not incrementally, not gradually, not as part of a broader trend that she contributed to alongside several other factors. She changed it the way Ruth changed baseball, by bringing an entirely new and entirely larger audience to a product that previously served a much smaller constituency, and by doing it fast enough and dramatically enough that the transformation was impossible to deny or misattribute. That is what Cooper's comparison means. And the analytical significance of that comparison in the current context is pointed in a specific and uncomfortable direction. Because if Clark is to women's basketball what Ruth was to baseball, if her presence is the specific, irreplaceable commercial driver of everything the league's current moment represents, then the organizational decisions being made around her inside the Indiana Fever carry implications that extend far beyond whether Indiana wins or loses any particular game. They carry implications for whether the commercial transformation Clark produced becomes the foundation of something durable and lasting, or whether it gets squandered by an organization that consistently fails to make the decisions that honor and maximize what she represents. Ruth played for the Yankees. The Yankees built around him. They designed their most important moments around him. They did not draw up the biggest possession of the biggest game for someone other than him and hope it worked out. The contrast is not flattering for Indiana. The 2-hour meeting that Cunningham referenced earlier this season deserves its place in this conversation too, because it remains one of the most intriguing, unresolved threads in the entire Indiana Fever story. The meeting happened. Cunningham confirmed it. Mitchell's reaction at the podium confirmed that its existence was not something the organization had planned to discuss publicly. What was in that meeting? What was discussed? What decisions were made? What conflicts were aired? What organizational realities were put on the table in a room that the team apparently spent 2 hours in? None of that has been fully disclosed, and responsible analysis acknowledges that limitation. But the existence of a significant organizational meeting that the team did not volunteer to the public, combined with the pattern of everything that has come before and after it, adds a layer of texture to the picture of this organization that is impossible to ignore. Teams that are functioning smoothly, teams where the internal culture is healthy and the organizational dynamics are working, do not typically generate this many signals of internal friction finding their way to the surface through unofficial channels. What Cunningham's behavior across this entire season illuminates, when you look at it as a complete body of evidence rather than a series of isolated incidents, is an internal organizational culture that does not present a unified front on the question of how Caitlin Clark is being treated inside this building. The defensive scheme disclosure, the meeting reference, the Instagram confirmation of the play design, these are not random. They form a pattern. And the pattern suggests that not everyone inside the Indiana Fever is comfortable with the decisions being made at the organizational level. If everyone in that locker room were genuinely aligned with the coaching approach and the play-calling philosophy and the way the most important possessions of games are being designed, there would be no current roster member willing to go on Instagram and confirm that the game-winning play was not drawn up for Clark. That is the permanent public record now. That is not going away. And it sits alongside Cynthia Cooper's historically grounded framing of what Clark represents for women's basketball to produce a picture that is both inspiring and deeply troubling at the same time. Inspiring because Clark continues to perform at a level that transcends the organizational environment surrounding her. She saved a game she was not designed to save, on a play she was not supposed to have. She converted under the kind of pressure that breaks players who have not built the mental architecture to handle it. She is doing what transformational athletes do, which is producing extraordinary results despite the conditions, rather than because of them. And troubling, because the conditions keep generating evidence that the people responsible for maximizing what she represents are consistently failing to do that. The play was not drawn up for her. The most important possession of a game Indiana nearly lost was not designed around the player who is the specific, irreplaceable reason this league's commercial moment exists. She won it anyway. And now everyone knows both of those things are true, because a teammate decided the truth was more important than the story the organization would have preferred the public to receive. The Indiana Fever won the Washington Mystics game. Clark hit the shot. The scoreboard says what it says, and that part of the story is not in dispute. But the full story, the story of how that shot came to exist, who it was designed for, who actually produced it, and under what circumstances, that story is now fully documented, and it raises a question that the fan community, the media, the analytical voices who have been tracking the situation all season, and frankly, the league itself, should be sitting with seriously. If you have the player who changed everything, the player whose arrival transformed the commercial and cultural landscape of your sport in the most dramatic fashion since Babe Ruth did it for baseball a century ago, what exactly are you doing drawing up the most important play of the most important possession for someone else? What is the organizational philosophy that produces that decision? And how long before the gap between that philosophy and the reality of what Clark represents produces consequences that cannot be recovered from? Cunningham answered the question that was being asked. The bigger questions are still sitting there, waiting.